Welcome to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I'm your host, Dr. Erin Bailey. This podcast celebrates the power of books and the joy of reading. In each episode, we talk with educators, librarians, families, authors, and literacy champions to explore one big question: what does reading inspire for you? Through stories, research, and real-world experiences from classrooms, libraries, and homes, we explore what literacy looks like and why it matters. Whether you're nurturing young readers, shaping learning spaces, or simply love a good book, we're glad you're here. Be sure to subscribe to get the latest episode. Let's get inspired. Welcome. Today I'm joined by Khrisma Antoinette. She is an author of relationship-focused children's books for children in non-traditional family structures such as He's Mine and Precious Love, which I will link for you all below. And welcome, Khrisma. I'm glad to have you back. We've done webinars together in the past, so it's wonderful to see you again.
Yes, and I'm so excited to be with you again today.
So let's start off with a little bit about your journey and your background. You describe yourself as a community-driven visionary and storyteller. Can you share a little bit about your personal literacy journey and how your childhood experiences shaped the stories that you write today?
Yes, when I think about my personal story when it comes to falling in love with reading enough to actually want to be an author and write those stories for other people, I of course always think about my mother. I'm sure a lot of people have the similar experiences of their parents being the first ones to introduce them to certain books. So my mother was always the one that was always putting a book in my hand. So I was never afraid to read. I was always encouraged to do so. But one of the more pivotal moments when I think about my reading and literacy journey actually happened in my church when I was around the middle school, like seventh and eighth grade, because I was always an avid reader. Like I said, my mother always gave me a book. I always had a library card. We were always going to the library. But I never realized what I lacked in terms of what I was reading until I was in that middle school age range in my book club at my church, where they started their own book club where we were reading books. And for the first time in my life, I was exposed to a book with a main character that looked like me, who was African American. And at that time, I didn't even realize that that was something I had missed. It wasn't like I wasn't reading books that I enjoyed or I wasn't reading books that weren't fun for me, but I never had even stopped as a kid to think, oh, I never had a book where the main character had the same skin color as me or had a similar experience to me. And I bring that up because that's a third space, right? I had that experience in a church, not in the library, not in the school, not even at home, right? Where my mom was always exposing me to books because she too didn't really recognize the importance of doing that or having the resources to understand how to do that. But my church family really starting that book club with that intentionality there of making sure the kids in our church were exposed to books that looked like them was an eye-opening experience that kind of carried me forward in my career of not only do I love books, but I love books that have stories that look like me. But what happens when I run out of those books? I remember when I aged out of the book club and I still went to their meetings and I was like, well, what else can I read? At that point, I had read out the Sharon M. Draper books and different things like that. So exploring more on my own, but still seeing that there was a lack there that I wanted to continue to add to the bookcases around the world to make sure that we have more stories for the kids so they can see themselves reflected in the pages of the books before they even recognize they need to ask for those kind of stories.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I love so much about that. First of all, the way that you describe church as a third space, especially for someone who studies out of school literacies and informal learning spaces, like church is a great example of a third space where a lot of people do their learning. And I also appreciate the way you described and I've heard other people share this experience too, where the books that you were reading, there was nothing wrong with them. You enjoyed them. But when you were introduced to books that had characters that looked like you, maybe had similar backgrounds to you, there was a deeper connection there. Not dismissing the other connections you had had with the other books, but there was a different kind of a connection. But the fact that at the time as a child you recognized that those books were limited in quantity and that they were going to run out or that you were going to age out of them. And I feel like that's a problem that we're still solving for. I think it's getting better, but that you were able to recognize that as from such a young age. So now the books that you write, they feature what you refer to as non-traditional family structures. And these create opportunities for sometimes challenging or difficult but important conversations. Why do you think it's so important for children to see their own families and experiences reflected in the literature? And maybe you can give a couple examples from your books if you don't mind.
Yeah, I don't mind to do that at all. So one of the biggest things I take into consideration as an author, like you said, I try to write relationship-focused children's books for youth and non-traditional family structures to really jumpstart those difficult conversations around the intense emotions and experiences that they encounter daily. And even when I think about that mission statement, right, that I have, I always battle with saying like difficult conversations, right?
Hmm.
Because I don't want to give like a negative connotation to just having a conversation about life. And life has ups and downs, but I think acknowledging that there is sometimes a challenge or like resistance to have conversations that are not as sunshine and rainbows, especially when it comes to kids, is important to acknowledge. And so, especially thinking about why I wanted to do non-traditional family structures, again, going back to literature, as you were pointing out, we have made a lot of progress, I would say, in terms of the number of like multicultural books that we have available. There's still a lot more work to be done, but it definitely has gotten better over the years. But even with that, I didn't see representation in terms of families being showcased in books as well. And I think that's, again, you don't realize that until you experience a good example and you want to have more of it. So I think about when I was younger, in terms of when I say younger at this point, I mean like a college age student, right, who is now like studying this kind of stuff for fun. When I took like a multicultural literature class in my college, we studied like Jacqueline Woodson, for example, who has a
Hmm.
plethora of great books. But I think about a book that she wrote called Visiting Day, which is about like a young girl visiting her father who was in jail. And like those few examples here, like blips here and there, I think about Milo Imagines the World. I forget who writes that book, but also like a young boy on a way to visit his father in jail. And how we have these representations, but there's so few like little blimps in the skies when it comes to actually showcasing family structures. And so I wanted to add to that cosmos, right? Of we can showcase families who are incarcerated. So those examples were incarcerated stories. He's Mine, which is my second picture book, follows a young boy named DeAndre and his experience with his incarcerated father. But also just the totality of how every family structure looks different, even within just a stereotypical label of incarcerated parent. Everyone has a different experience with that. Even thinking about my first book, Precious Love, which is about a blended family and a young girl who has a father-daughter dance at school, and how she navigates that challenge of wanting to go to the school dance, wanting to go with her actual father, but going with her stepdad instead, going through all those motions. It's important to showcase that to kids so that way they know that every family is worth celebrating. Going back to what I said earlier, when I was in college, it wasn't my major, English, even though I made it my minor, it should have been my overall major. But in those minor classes where I was focusing on children's literature, especially, we always talked about, and I'm sure you're familiar with this too, Erin, Rudine Sims Bishop and her
Hmm.
philosophy about windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And so having a book be a mirror, right, reflecting someone's life, allowing it to be a window so that way you can see into a different world than your own. And that sliding glass door to really like step into it and fully engage in that reality. That philosophy has been like the pinnacle of children's literature, multicultural literature for years. And but applying that when it comes to families so that way kids can see that for themselves, but also for their peers to also see the lives of their classmates or people around them to better understand that someone may be picking up their friend who is not a mom or a dad, who is an aunt, who is an uncle, a grandparent, a brother, a sister, or a foster parent. But it doesn't mean that their family isn't as worthwhile as theirs. And oftentimes in literature and in mainstream media as well, we stay stuck in a two-parent household being the traditional family structure. And when we do those representations of other family structures, they're not always with a positive light, which
Hmm.
I would
Hmm.
say, which is something that I really wanted to combat of let's talk about these things, acknowledge that it is hard, but how do we move forward when things are hard? And that's the storyline of most of my books of this may not be what I want, but this is amazing the way that it is. And allowing kids to have that visibility there, I find to be very useful. Like I think about when I did a read aloud once at a school with Precious Love, which is about the father-daughter dance at school. A little girl spoke up and was like, "Oh, my dad just died recently, like in a fire." But because of how your story goes, basically what you taught me is that even though he's gone, I can still go trick or treating with my mom and my grandma, and like I can still do fun stuff, which was, kids info dump, without you asking them. But it was great for her, even though it wasn't a direct one to one of how her family looked. Just that acknowledgement of families look different, and that's okay, was enough for her to realize like I can still continue to live my life.
I wish, and I think I hear you like grappling with this too as you're describing it. Like, I wish we could move beyond having to call it non-traditional families.
Yeah.
And I know, like, obviously, you use that word because it's what's going to resonate with the most people. But I like, but it's like it feels like a compare and contrast then, right? But to your point, like
Yeah,
even our quote unquote traditional family, like nobody's normal. There's
yeah,
no such thing as normal. Like every single family is different and complex. And so that's why I appreciate what you've done so much and it resonates with me. And honestly, it's something that I don't think I thought about enough as a teacher. Every single year that I was a teacher, I had at least one student who had a parent or a family member who was incarcerated. And I never even thought to have that kind of representation in the books that I had available in my classroom. I was trained in trauma informed teaching, so I knew how to work with those students, but I don't think I necessarily saw literature as the way to do so. So it resonates so much with me that you did that. I wonder if you can share a little bit around your thoughts of like, because you said this, like, not to show it in a negative light, but like that example, incarceration, that is typically in a negative light. Like, how have you been
yeah.
able to capture some of the not positive, but like we're still family aspects in your writing and storytelling?
Yeah, something I haven't mentioned, and I don't talk about it nearly as much as I should, is that when I write my books, before I start the writing process, again, I'm a scholar at heart. I actually reach out to different people who have this lived experience, right? Because I don't want to assume that what my perception is the factual evidence that I have in the world. So beyond just like looking at different books that are already written, different media, videos, and documentaries and different things like that, actually doing those focus groups and interviews with people who are children of incarcerated parents, for example, or parents themselves who were incarcerated while like their kids were really young. And also on the other side of the equation, and maybe this comes in, my mom is a social worker, so this might be like adding in like the lens of where I come at with stuff. Talking to social workers who also work with these family dynamics who are being that bridge, talking to different people, right? Just to get that different perspective in there. And when I'm having those interviews and as I'm like going through the data of what I've gathered in those conversations, just thinking about what are the similarities that we're all having? Because again, it's not a one-to-one. Like what one person experiences is not what another person experiences. For the incarcerated parent book, for example, my uncle was incarcerated. So how that affected me as his niece is different than how it affected my cousin, who that was her actual dad. Acknowledging that both of those things are very valid and truthful experiences, but the intensities and the emotions look a little bit different and manifest in different ways. And so it was important to include that. And that's something that I do, like going back to your point about writing the books with that intentionality there of I'm not going to write the book that's going to hit on every single note for every single person, but what are the similar themes or feelings or experiences that we all have? So with the incarcerated parent, for example, something that's repeated a lot in He's Mine came from one of the interviews that I had because I heard this similar thing being said specifically from the children of incarcerated parents. Especially when I'm talking to them, like they're adults now, right? So them reflecting on themselves like as children, where they kept saying that, my mom or my dad, my aunt, my uncle, whoever it was, I know that they did something that was quote unquote wrong, but to me, they were just my parent or they were just my person, like whatever the fill in the blank was. And that was like, I get goosebumps myself thinking about it, but it was just like a simple thing, right? Like them just explaining, like they did something wrong. I know that it was wrong, quote unquote, but I still love them because that's a thought process that once someone gets the label of a criminal, we
Mm-hmm.
lose that, right? They lose that ability to be loved, to be seen as anything positive. But we think about them being a title to someone else.
Yeah.
That's the main thing, especially for a kid, if they're their mom, their dad, their aunt, their uncle. That matters more to them than anything else. And I remember when I got my Pays Mine, like my first few drafts and going through the beta readers, that was the main thing I got critiqued a lot in the book was that I never talked about why was the main character DeAndre's dad in jail, or
Mm.
why did he keep repeating like, my dad is a good person who just makes bad choices. Like they were like, you should explain this more, give more context, and that's something that, as an author, of course, you're taking feedback and edits and different things, but staying to the integrity of why I did those interviews in the first place to maintain the honesty and raw feelings that people have of yes and right and being able
Mm-hmm.
to have that in without being worried about people not understanding because that goes back to the windows mirrors and doorways thing, right? That's a mirror to someone who understands it. If you get it, right? But it's a window for someone else to force themselves to think outside of what society has taught them. And really quickly, I'll tell the story too. When it came to illustrating He's Mine as an example, I always loved that me and my illustrator had to have like a real serious conversation about the book, more serious than we did the first time around with Precious Love. because when I had her draw the images of what DeAndre's father looked like, just giving her the premise of the book, and like before we start the overall project, let's just establish what does DeAndre look like and what does his father look like. The first image she did of his father was very like stereotypical what society and media has taught us what someone in jail looks like. And I had to ask her, if you didn't know that his father was incarcerated, how would you draw
Mm,
him? And that was like a good conversation for us to have. Where I was like, this is, it doesn't look bad, but if I did not give you the premise of this book, if I just told you to draw a boy and his father, would you draw him the same way? And so from there we reworked it and everything like that. But I think that importance of having that visibility, being willing to challenge things and get people to get a little bit uncomfortable is so key when it comes to the storytelling of something that's important and lived experiences for people.
yeah. That reminds me of when um, we were designing the curriculum for our play-based literacy program, which I can also link for everyone below here too. But one of our units is around families. And so we have a dollhouse. So online, and again, I'll link it for you. There's printable materials that an educator or a family can use to create a dollhouse kind of like setting at their home or in their classroom. And the vision that I had was like these printable frames with pictures of families in them. But I wanted to be as inclusive as I could of different kinds of families. And I am not kidding you. Our graphic designer at Reading is Fundamental, bless her, especially if she's listening, because I gave so much feedback. I would wake up in the middle of the night, just like random things. I would wake up in the middle of the night and be like, one of the family members should have tattoos on their arm because families have tattoos. Like, just
Yes.
like the most random things ever. Like, there should be a family with a dog. Families have dogs, like all kinds of things, till I got to a point where, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, like, you cannot represent everyone, and you have to
Yeah.
acknowledge to yourself and give yourself permission that like someone is not going to be included and represented, but maybe what they can achieve, to your point, like the story that you shared earlier of the girl who her she was experiencing not a blended family, but she had a father who passed recently, so she was sharing a similar experience. Like, that's kind of the sliding glass doors part of like,
Yeah.
you can step into somebody else's experience and find a commonality, even if it isn't exactly the experience that you're having. So, long story, after many, many revisions, we got these
Yeah.
family portraits to a place that we were comfortable with, but I had to give myself permission that, like, not every child was going to see these pictures and see their exact family represented, and that's okay too.
That sounds like an amazing project that you all did.
Yes,
Like, I am over
yes.
here like, this sounds really great. I would love to have this like the kids I work with.
Yes, I will be sure to link it. And it also comes with books and read aloud guides and all of that fun stuff too. So kind of thinking about family engagement, this is your specialty. It's something that's talked about, I think, increasingly in schools.
Hmm.
Um, but many families are unsure where to begin. So what are some simple, meaningful ways that family members can build literacy experiences at home, even, with their busy schedules?
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned like with your busy schedules because something I mentioned to my mom, I feel like middle school age me was having so many realizations, and I mean that's a normal thing in middle school. I feel like I was really like a savage. My mother brings up often how I told her. So I was raised by a single parent, and she also was a social worker. So when she came home, battery was drained,
Oh
dead,
yeah.
had nothing left to give. And so something I told her though as a kid that she still brings up now that I'm an adult is that I once told her, you were always here, but you were never present. And now that I think about it, I'm like, okay, I can see where like that hurt her feelings as an adult, especially when you're doing everything right. Like she was
Hmm.
always there. But we had further conversations about it, right? Of like, what do I mean by like you weren't really present? Like you were there physically, pick me up, drop me off, like put me in programs. Like I know you were there, but I also know you weren't fully paying attention because your
Hmm.
attention was divided in so many different ways. You came back home really drained. And so even with that, like what she did for me as a kid, like I mentioned, I had a library card. I would go get the books from a library, read them, and enjoy myself. But something that would have made that experience a lot more richer that I think a lot of families should consider, especially if you take advantage of free resources like all the things that you're listing from Reading is Fundamental or public library programs. Or when you see your kid reading a book, one, are you allowing them to read books for fun? Or are you allowing them to read books for school and assignments? And I
Mm,
think that one distinction is really important that yes, like my kid reads because they have to meet their like reading quota or they have to do like their certain amount of books for summer reading so we can get a prize. But are we allowing space for kids just to pick a book for fun to read without there being any type of punitive, positive, even awards given, right? But also being intentional with asking them, what are you reading? Or what do you enjoy about the book that you're reading? And actually meaning that question when you ask it. And I say that because when you work with kids a lot, they start to understand, like when you go through the pleasantries of like, how are you? How are things? And like they know like you don't fully mean it when you're asking because it's a normal thing that you're just saying. But when you actually are engaging with them as little as you can, like I said, there's only 24 hours in a day. A lot of those hours are spent at work. But actually, when you see them reading a book once you've given it to them, when you ask them about the book, mean that question. If that's all the energy you have is to say, what are you reading? Why do you enjoy it? That means a lot. That shows that you actually are caring, that you're paying attention. Like I think for myself, I'm glad this wasn't like a question that you've asked before. I was like, what's your favorite book? Because I always grapple with that question, not just because I have like a million books, but I think some of my favorite books have become more like higher on that list because of family members that have been more invested in it. So I think
hmm.
about Elizabeth Acevedo. She wrote this chapter book called With the Fire on High. So she's more famous for like the Poet X. But With the Fire on High, it's like her second or third book. But it's not like my favorite book in the world. It's a great book, but not like my top 10. But I would put it in my top 10 because I remember reading it at my grandmother's house and just like laughing to myself as you do when you read a book, just enjoying my own time reading it. And she was like, what's so funny? Why are you laughing? And me just explaining like the joke there and giving the background and the context. And then from there, she would just periodically, like on a weekly, monthly basis, sometimes like say, oh, what was happening in that book you were reading? Did you ever finish it? And that made me love that book a little bit more and actually want to keep reading the book, even when there was times where I like, you read books, you fall off, you don't pick it up for a few days. But I was like, oh, my grandmother actually is invested in this story. She actually cares about what's going on, and it made it like a communal, a shared reading experience that made that book a lot more valuable for me. So allowing kids to read for fun, but also being intentional with your energy of asking them what's going on in that book and actually meaning that with that follow through of listening and asking even like some follow up questions. It doesn't have to be the same day, could be later on, but showing that you're invested in their process of reading as well.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't agree more. Like I've talked to many guests on the show before about that social element to reading, and I'll share it again. We often think about reading as something that happens between the text, the author, and the reader, but you bring in that it was my aunt's favorite book. My grandma's reading it right now. That actually adds another, it creates a third space to go back to that. Like you've now
Yeah.
created a third space between the text and yourself and this person that you're building a social relationship with. And it's such a powerful thing. So it's a great, very simple tip for families. Allow your child to read books for fun and then just ask them about what they're reading. It's truly amazing. Like I believe that if a child wants to share something with you, they will
Yes.
find a way to share it with you. I experienced this a lot as a teacher. So you never know, like your child could be going through a very difficult social situation at school or something, friendship drama, and you could ask them, what are you reading? And they start to tell the story of the characters in the book, but then somehow they start like slipping in the
Yeah.
social challenge that they're having with their own friendship group at school or something. And that is a powerful way to connect to your child and help them with whatever they're going through and to be more present to your point about that as well.
Yeah, I think there's no like limits to what you're able to do when it comes to being just intentional. Like, and intentionality can be big, but also I think the smallest things when you're intentional make the biggest impact too.
Yeah. So I know we touched on this a little bit earlier about multicultural literature, but you've worked in libraries and different literacy and community initiatives. What have you learned through your experiences about the connection between representation, culturally relevant children's books, and how that like helps create stronger family engagement?
Oh, what have I learned? Honestly, I think the thing that surprised me the most is that when you introduce like a multicultural book or a book that is a mirror to a child, it actually benefits the overall family. And that's something that I think we understand of how much like I keep talking about like, oh, I read a book and my grandma got to read the book as well. Like that's one book was brought into my grandmother's household for me, but it benefited the entire family unit.
Hmm.
I think that's a beautiful thing about it, especially when it is a book that is actually reflective because I am relatively young. So me sharing my experience about not getting a book that looked like me until I was about 12, 13, thinking about that from a modern age of now to my mother to my grandmother, if I was barely getting it, I can only imagine what limited options my grandmother had,
Yeah.
right? And so, in terms of me being able to provide a book into her space, bring it in there as the student who's getting access to those different things, and for her to see an Afro Latina story in the pages of a book published worldwide and the impact there, all because it was a multicultural story that I found interest in. And so sometimes it really is just thinking about how one book can really have that ripple effect, but you don't know that at first when you just hand a book to one person. You don't know what homes they're going into. And I think that's the beautiful thing about how much it can ripple, that sometimes the beauty of the effect is sometimes that you don't get to see it. Right. Like you may like go on a walk, for example, you may see like a caterpillar, or you may see like a cocoon, or you may see a butterfly, but you never see like the inner, like the in
Mm.
between process
Hmm.
of it. You only see like one of those big stages there, but you don't see like the process of getting there. And that sometimes is what it's like when you give a book to someone, of seeing that ripple effect. You don't get to see it, but we know it is happening. And that's sometimes the most beautiful part of it all. It's like allowing a child to have the power in that instance to introduce something to their overall family.
Yeah, and I think too, like that's a perfect example of like your mother or your grandmother may not have seen themselves represented growing up, but were still avid readers, and how powerful, like what a way to open up a dialogue too between a child and a parent of like look at these beautiful books that we get to read together. When I was a child, we didn't have all of these books, and that's true for modern storytelling. What about more like stories that have been passed through oral traditions, and those like stories that have been passed down for generations? Is there power in a child choosing a book that's like, hey, my grandma used to tell this story and now I'm seeing it in book format?
Oh my gosh, there's so much power in that. And I think it's also the other side of that as well, like you said, because I love kids because they're like the most honest creatures on the earth. But the other side of things of being like, my grandma doesn't tell the story this way, right? And like even
Yeah.
having that conversation there of like, that's not how I remember it being, like thinking about those windows, mirrors with those doorways, right? For them
Yes.
to be able to fully engage. And even going back further to our conversation, I mentioned the young girl who had her father who passed away. Sometimes those doors of those conversations are opened up through literature. And so I think sometimes like the elders in our family, there are things that they would like to tell us, but until they're like prompted in that way, the same way with kids, right? Of them being prompted to tell that story, sometimes that does come through a book, where then you're able to have those further conversations there, which I think is always just so powerful and impactful of what a book can do to make someone want to speak up, whether it's for like in favor or against. But no matter what, we're having those dialogues. And to your point, oral traditions or oral storytelling has been one of the most important things when it comes to stories. That's why we started writing them down, because they were orally told to us to make sure that we're telling them correctly. And so keeping those up is really important. I think books open up those doors to those conversations, whether that's for the kid or for the adult.
Yes. When when you shared that, like I taught first grade, I could picture it perfectly. Like I'm about to read the book Stone Soup. There are many versions of Stone Soup, and I start reading the book, and then I have the one student who's like, my grandma doesn't tell it that way. And then they want to tell you all the things that are different, which is a great literacy activity, in and of itself. So it's really cool. And then, it's a great way for students to relate to each other, like, oh, my grandma tells it this way, my grandma or grandpa tells it that way, and they can compare with each other as well.
Yeah, I've even had some kids that I've worked with, like, who like have their bedtime stories, and their parents like make them the main character when they tell
Yeah.
like a classical fairy tale. So in their mind, they're like, "We're reading Hansel and Gretel. Where am I? Like, I'm supposed to be in this story as well." And that's like the beauty of, like you said, like that's a
Yeah.
fun family like literacy activity. Going back to what can you do with limited time and a busy schedule, even if you're just retelling the same stories that we all know, but you add your family into the story, how does that look differently? That's the same thing we see in most cartoons. Like think about the Tom and Jerry's that were doing like spoofs of like major Hans and
Yeah.
Gretel, different things. Like they just put Tom and Jerry in those situations, putting your family in a situation where like now you are being chased by whatever. right, that goes on in the story. That's also a fun way to bring reading and literacy into your home.
Yeah, I love it. When we've partnered in the past, we've talked about putting together family literacy events, ones that, these can happen at schools or libraries or community spaces that are truly welcoming, impactful, and inclusive. What suggestions do you have for people like librarians or educators who are putting together a family literacy event, especially for families like the ones in your books who may not have always felt the most connected or the most welcome into school spaces?
Yes, this is such, I don't want to say the word loaded in a negative way, but it is such a loaded question because there's so much that goes into getting people who don't typically feel comfortable in certain spaces to actually come into that
Hmm.
space. Like the first thing that popped into my mind when you said that, I always think about how are we greeting people like at the door? Like to make a place welcoming, yes, we have to be intentional with what's going on inside the building, but even just at the front door, do we have greeters at the front
Hmm.
door? Do we have greeters that are going to, smile, welcome people in, answer questions? I remember I worked in one community, it was a primarily Latino community. And one of the things our director had us do was like just memorize this opening like speech real quick in Spanish, just in case we get some families. I don't even think I remember it. Like I know how to say like me llamo es Charisma, muy estás, like aquí. I don't know. But like just having that simple, like I learned my two sentences to
Hmm.
say, my name is this. I'm so happy you're here. We're gonna get started in the cafeteria, right? Just those little things to be mindful of, especially with the community that you're serving. So that way people, as they're coming in tentatively, hesitantly, feel like they are welcome. Like this is a place they're supposed to be in, not just you're in the right place, but you are supposed to be here. Those are two different kinds of welcomes. Um, Outside of that, like being intentional about the actual activities that you're doing. So I think sometimes we do our literacy events, and I'm so glad that at Reading is Fundamental, you all say like family literacy, because sometimes I see people do like parent nights or parent
Yeah.
literacy, different things like that. So being more inclusive in that language, I think is a new thing that's been happening, and that's actually beneficial as well to get more people to want to come. But also like, are the activities or are the books that we're reading, are we promoting a multi-generational family experience? Like, are we just doing something that just a 0 to 3 year old can enjoy, but are we also doing something that their parent can also engage in? And so being mindful in those activities. Of course, you can't force anyone to do everything like together as a group. And you also know from working with kids, sometimes kids are like, no, this is my paper. I am writing on this. I don't need your help, mom, dad, grandma. I got this. But are we allowing there to be spaces and intentionality there and what we're asking them to do that can be done as an overall group? And also, is everyone leaving with something? Oftentimes I think the goodie bags go straight to the kids, but also
Hmm.
the parents get to have something as well, so that way they can really engage with it and fall in love with the process. One of the things I used to do many moons ago was that I worked for Indie Reads, which I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're like a nonprofit here in Indiana. But basically, their premise was they wanted to help adults with a below sixth grade reading level learn how to read. And that was one of the most rewarding and heartbreaking experiences that I've had to do in my life, because when you're working with someone who is 50 plus, right, and they don't know the difference between the word tree and three, right?
Mm.
And it takes a lot of courage for them to show up every day
Yeah.
to want to learn how to read and understand that they should know how to read. And they all have their reasons why in terms of different things that happen to make them fall that far behind. But I worked with one woman who was actually the grandmother of someone I went to school with. And that was a conversation we had where she asked me, like, don't let my granddaughter know that, I come to these meetings and I do these events because I eventually want to be able to read the cards that her and her siblings write for me. I've never told them that I couldn't read their cards, but I want to one day be able to read their cards. I want to one day be able to write something back to them. And so even working with her and getting her comfortable enough and confident enough to go to an activity with her great granddaughter at her school, it takes a lot of stuff behind the scenes, and just knowing that a lot of people who are coming with their kids or with their small person, they are maybe going through a lot just to step into that space. And so make sure that it's welcoming, but also are we providing opportunities for them to also leave with something as well?
Yeah.
Because you may not know also the adult that they're with also may not have the same ability to read on a certain level. We're just assuming because they're an adult, they should be at least a high school age reading level, but they might be a lot lower than even their child that they're with. And so in what
Mm.
ways are we providing comfortable opportunities for them to engage where it doesn't feel like we're talking down on them, but also uplifting them in a space too when it comes to literacy?
Yeah. The word I hear the most like coming through in your answer is welcoming. Like on the two
Mm-hmm.
tail ends, most importantly, like welcoming when they come in. Because if you walk into a space and you don't feel welcome there, it doesn't matter how important the information that's going to be shared is, like you're going to be turned off, right? And then same thing,
Yeah.
like when you're leaving, when you're exiting, like you want to fill your families with this like energy that like we were so glad that you were here and we want you to
Hmm.
come back and we're going to see it again. So it's like the two bookends. Like you could have a perfect event planned, but if you don't have those beginning and ending pieces, like you're going to lose people. It reminds me of a lot of, and this reminds me of like your church example earlier, like just even asking people like, how are you welcomed into other community spaces like your church, right? And I learned this
Yeah.
through one of my students actually when I taught first grade. Like when I grew up, the church that I went to, you would go in, everything would be very quiet, and you just like kind of kneel down and pray to yourself until it started,
Hmm.
right? And that was kind of the way I had my classroom. We had a staggered arrival time. So more or
Okay.
less like I had some calming music on in the morning and it was about 10 or 15 minutes that the kids would trickle in. We didn't have a concrete start time. And so kids would trickle in. I'd have quiet, independent activities at the table. So it was a very like calming start to the day. And then once it got to be, 9 o'clock or whatever, we'd ring a chime and we'd start our morning meeting. But I had a student who would come in so loud and just like announcing herself and like, hey, everybody, and wanting to like give hugs and stuff. And it was like throwing me off so much because it was so different. And so one day I just pulled her aside and just asked her, like, hey, when you go to church on the weekends, when you go home, like, what's it like when you arrive? And she's like, oh, yeah, everyone's like announces their arrival and
Yeah.
hugs each other and stuff. And I was like, okay, this makes sense why we're having such a different experience in the morning. And I was like, how can I find a middle ground where she can still feel welcomed in the way that
Yeah.
she's used to being welcomed, but I can still have like the calm kind of entryway. So every day I would just meet her at the door with a few other students so we could do the like,
That's nice.
hi, how are you? Like hugging and announcing that I'm here. And then she knew like when we enter the classroom, we're going to do the like, I'm gonna unpack my bag kind of quietly and start my morning work quietly kind of thing. Like you can find a way to meet people in the middle.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that you said like meeting them in the middle because I think sometimes we go like too loud or we go too soft with it.
Yes.
And it's like a Goldilocks situation of finding what works best for people because sometimes
Yeah.
being too loud can be a turn off from people.
Especially it's like bright and early in the morning, but it's worth asking, like, right? Like if I hadn't stopped to ask her, like when you go to, your relative's house on the weekend or your church on the weekend, how are you greeted when you get there? Like that's important. And you can include a lot of different ways to welcome people to a space so that, everyone feels that they like their values are appreciated there.
Hmm. Love that.
Okay, well, I know we're reaching the end. I started mixing it up recently. I usually ask, what does reading inspire for you? I recently added a choose your own adventure. So if you'd rather, you can share who inspired you to read.
Oh my goodness. Well, I feel like the easiest answer for like who inspired me to read was my mother. But if I go like even deeper, I remember like in the second grade, and I actually went back to talk to my second grade teacher about this because I felt like this wasn't allowed. But in my second grade in my school system here in Indiana, for some reason that year we didn't have a library. Like, you have your electives of
Mm-hmm.
PE, art, gym, or I said PE, art, gym twice. Anyway, you have your electives, and the library was part of that. For some reason that year we didn't have library. And I like recently reached out to my teacher later on, like, what happened with that? Apparently, like, we just didn't have a library in that year. So, like, library was not an option. But my elementary school was like right next to our public library. And so I remember us walking from school to the public library. And that always stuck out in my mind because, as a kid, especially a kid, single parent household, my mom was always on top of things. I was like, I didn't sign a permission slip to do this. Like, I don't think we're supposed to be going out the building. And like, it wasn't like we had to cross like a major street, like a little bit, like a little bridge and stuff. I was like, I don't think we're supposed to be here. But that was, I always stick that out like in my mind when it comes to that experience in second grade because now I work as a librarian, and that was one of the things of yes, I always had been to the library, but that kind of trip of the public library, and that's been so young, I think really got me thinking like, oh, I can actually work here, not just go in and get my book and then leave, but like stay for a program. So we ended up going over there. We stayed for like a program that they had at the public library. Our teacher at the time, I didn't know this, let us all check out books like on her library card. We went
Wow.
back to our school. lived our lives. She somehow got all the books back from her students. It didn't get like a massive fine. But I really appreciate her doing that work because you just never know like the benefit there. And also like she did tell me like she was not allowed to do that. So I'm sure you understand the teacher
Yes.
going above and beyond in that way of, okay, we can go to the library and really like bring the library to your students, her recognizing that it was so important for us to have that and us not to miss that at all throughout our school year in some small way. And I think about like other teachers I've had over the years who have done small things like that. Like I said, small intentional moments that have big ripple effects that you just never know. Even in kindergarten, I remember like dismissal. And before we would dismiss, our teacher would gather us around to do a story time. For some reason, right before we left school, like squeeze in one last morsel of education. But she never read picture books to us, even though we were in kindergarten. Like she
Oh,
read chapter books. And even as a
wow.
kid, I was thinking like, these books are not, these are too advanced for us. But they were like the Junie B. Jones books. So they're not
Mhm.
like super complicated books. But I think as a little kid, I was like, this is a chapter book. I don't think I'm supposed to be reading this. But I think about my kindergarten teacher, Miss Grezalonic, now Mrs. Anderson, because she had the nerve to get married once I figured out how to spell Grezalonic, which was so hard as a kindergartner. But I remember her doing that, and I was just like so in love with Junie B. Jones at that time, just because she saw fit for us to read a chapter book and like build up our interest in that way, like
Yeah.
one chapter at a time, instead of just flying through picture books left and right. And so from kindergarten to second grade, there's like so many more stories I can share. Like, and I'm sure you understand as a former teacher yourself, you never know what those small things that our
Mhm.
teachers are doing that have big impacts, big influences that aren't the standard, aren't what they're being told to do, but are things that they are just passionate about and care enough about their students to go that extra mile to really help inspire that next generation of readers, the next generation of librarians, authors, engineers, whatever that could be. And so I love to lift up my teachers just in a sense because one, teachers aren't paid enough. And especially when you're going that extra mile and you never know the fruits of that until many moons later of how that really affected a child. You doing one thing differently or doing one extra thing that you could or could not get in trouble for, but you do it all in the instance of just caring for your students.
Oh, that like fills my heart with so much joy. Charisma, thank you for saying that. If you're listening and you're a teacher, like it is those small in between moments, those things that you do that you might get in trouble for. You heard it from her, not
Yeah.
from me, that sometimes make the biggest impact in a child's life. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and your experiences with us today. If you're listening and this conversation resonated with you, please share it with a colleague, a family, a friend. We'd love to share this information with them. So thank you, Charisma.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Reading Inspires by Reading is Fundamental. I hope today's conversation sparked new ideas, meaningful connections, and a renewed love of reading. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with a fellow literacy champion, and join us next time as we continue exploring what reading inspires.